Hi, and welcome back to my kitchen. Now, a lot of particular dishes have a name attached to them, and that name is often concerned with a particular person. Thinking peach melba, tornadoes rossini, pavlova, and such forth. I've had a dish that's been rolling around my head for 2 or 3 years now without a name. And it only occurred to me that what it actually was the things that my late mother absolutely loved. She was a child of the war. She went through the Second World War, and as such had a massive respect for chicken, because before the days of free-range chickens, chicken was considered an absolute luxury, and definitely during the war to roast a chicken would have been tremendously exciting. She also had an absolute love for black pudding. So I've stuffed a chicken leg with black pudding for 2 or 3 years now without a name. But today I'm going to show you how to make chicken Margaret. On my board I have a couple of chicken legs. They are made up of the drumstick and the thigh. It's important that you get both because it won't work otherwise. Also, it's important you get just the leg and not the rib cage like a quarter piece of chicken is sometimes sold. This is sometimes called bizarrely the oyster cut, probably because the oyster lies just under the leg on a chicken. What we need to do is we need to bone out the thigh. Now don't be tempted to bone out the drumstick as well. It won't fully work, and you'll probably be here for about 3 or 4 years trying to pull out little bits and pieces. So leave the drumstick bone fully in the drumstick, and we just need to remove what is here, which is the thigh bone. It is still a little tricky and requires a bit of practice. What you need to do is get a small sharp knife, find the bone with your thumb, and then run the knife either side of that bone to reveal it as far up as you can to the knuckle point. Then you need to slide the knife under the bone, very careful not to get your fingers when you do this, and run it round the end of the bone that's exposed so that it stands up something like that. Then it's kind of like a scraping motion to pull the bone off the meat. Don't go too aggressively at this, otherwise you'll cut through the meat and the whole point of stuffing it will kind of be lost as it will all spill out, and that's not what we want. Now, we're getting towards the knuckle now, and this is where it gets a little bit fiddly. You have to find the joint between the drumstick bone and the bottom of the thigh bone and run your knife through that, the ligaments and there. Don't try and cut the bone. In fact, you won't be able to cut the bone, but don't try and cut the bone anyway, because it'll just blunt your knife. And gradually, once you've gone through that joint, peel away the meat from that particular joint and cut it out, and you're left with a fairly impressive thigh bone. You're also left with a very stuffable gap where the thigh bone has come out. Okay, so to the stuffing. I have here blitzed black pudding. Now, anybody who's watched my video with the duck dinner that I did will be more than aware of what I'm going to do now. But what I'm going to do, I've blitzed up some black pudding. I'm going to add some very ordinary breadcrumbs to it, dried though, rather than wet breadcrumbs. And I'm going to add an egg to that. This will be our stuffing. It's also the black pudding bomb recipe that I have used lots of times in the past and have done on video. So we mix this up till it forms a reasonable paste. Now don't be tempted to put too much egg into this. It will bind and it will be trapped anyway. So as a stuffing, it doesn't have to be kind of pate texture. It just has to hold together reasonably well. And you don't want it too eggy anyway. So just the one, and that's just a little medium egg, just the one medium egg will be fine, and it will hold together something like you see in the bowl now. Now there's far too much here, so I might be tempted to make some black pudding bonbons later. So what we need is about the amount of your finger, your index finger, because that's basically the size that the bone actually is. So we'll take the chicken leg that we've boned out, or the thigh at least that we've boned out, and we'll grab ourselves some of this lovely black pudding stuffing and shape it into a finger, very much like that, and pop it where the bone was, wrapping the flesh, and especially the skin if you can, around and about it. I boned out the other one earlier, so I should do that one as well. And we're going to take again about the amount of an index finger and slot it into the space that the bone once occupied and turn it over. Now, if we pop that in the oven, that's just going to explode horribly and spill out the black pudding and everything, and it's not going to be ideal. So what we're going to do is going to take a couple of cocktail sticks and tie everything together. We're going to tuck the end in, and we're going to diagonally slide a cocktail stick, it's a bit of a push, through the skin and onto the other side, and pull it through and tight, and do exactly the same with the other side, again going on a diagonal. I'm going to also tuck the end in, and just for this one I might slot one across the end as well, as it's looking a tiny bit like it might burst out. It doesn't have to be perfectly neat because the cooking process will tighten it a bit, but let's pop one through the end there just to be sure. There we go. Okay, and then we have what looks basically like a chicken leg, but we know the secret lies inside. So I shall just do the other one. Ooh. Pushing the cocktail stick through the skin is actually quite tough, so take your time, don't stab your finger or anything daft like that. And there we go. They are now ready to go in the oven. Okay, it's time for some veg. Now I must stress at this stage, the chicken has not yet gone into the oven. It will go into the oven with the potatoes we're going to make, because they'll cook in about the same sort of time. We're going to make parmentier potatoes, which are kind of mini roast potatoes, but there are a couple of things that you might do differently from your normal roast potatoes. I've got kind of one big and one small potato here, which will be plenty enough for 2 people. So I'm going to cut the potatoes into sort of slightly larger than centimetre cubes, but I'm not going to get terribly fussy about it. If we were doing it for somewhere very, very posh, I might get very, very fussy, and I might also peel the potatoes. I'm not going to do that either, simply because we're just making dinner. And actually, a little bit of messiness will actually look quite nice, and some craggy edges might look quite nice as well. So, much like you would with your roast potatoes for a roast dinner, we're going to parboil these, but there are a couple of differences. Firstly, we're going to only take 5 minutes over the parboiling, and secondly, we're not going to give them a good shake afterwards, because we don't need those crumbly edges. In fact, we don't want those crumbly edges, because the whole thing will just fall together. I always think parmentier are somewhere between a mini roast potato and a chip. Now I've got some boiling water on the hob ready to go. I've salted it, as you always should for potatoes, and I'm just going to pop them in there for 5 minutes, no more. Right. While they are boiling, I also have on the hob a pan with melted butter in it. Not very much melted butter, just a tickle. This will be for the sauce. So we're going to start the sauce with some shallots. And I'm just going to pop the shallots into there and sizzle them down. I don't want them to burn, but if they take a bit of colour, that would be a good thing. We're going to do a red wine reduction sauce, and that involves shallots and rosemary and garlic and red wine and balsamic vinegar. It's largely based on reducing the volume and thus building the flavour. Finally, we're going to have some cavolo nero with this. Now, there's a little trick I'd like to show you with cavolo nero. The spine is almost inedible, but the leaves are so delicious that they're worth fighting for. It's very, very fussy to cut the spine out. Normally, what you can do is if you grab the spine and you just run both hands up the spine, the whole thing comes off and you're left with a tiny bit of the spine at the end, and it's ready to eat. What we're going to do with these is very briefly steam them. I'm going to cool them down, and then I'm just going to roll them over in some butter. Crumbs, look at the size of that. I'm going to roll them over in some butter at the very last minute before we serve. 5 minutes have passed. My shallot has nicely sweated down and is just starting to take colour. This is the base of my sauce, as you can see there. I'm going to add a couple of flavours to that won't actually end up in the real sauce, but will add something. We'll take them out before we serve. I'm just smashed up a garlic clove, and I'm going to chuck that in. And I'm going to chuck just a few sprigs of rosemary in as well. I'm going to echo this with the potatoes in a few minutes. But I'm going to put that back on the heat with just the tiniest little bit of balsamic vinegar. And I'm going to reduce that down until it's basically a syrup. And here we have the potatoes. They've been parboiled, so they've had 2 to 5 minutes. I generally give them 5 minutes. They're a tiny bit soft on the outside, and I have not shaken them, so I've not tried to rough up the edges like you would with roasties. All I'm going to do is I'm going to add these to the pan where our 2 chicken legs are happily sitting, waiting to be roasted. I'm going to throw them all in, smush them around a bit. I'm going to add a tiny bit of oil, not too much because there's already a little bit of oil in there for the chicken, and the chicken and black pudding will actually give out a little bit of fat as well. I'm then going to add, once again, a couple of cloves of garlic and some rosemary, just to add something to it. Again, I won't serve these, but they'll just add something to the potatoes and have a nice echo in the sauce. All this now needs is a twist of salt, and it's ready to go in the oven. Right, the chicken and the potatoes are now safely in the oven, and my sauce so far has reduced to a almost syrupy-like consistency. It smells quite sweet and it smells quite vinegary. At this point, I'm going to add a couple of glasses of red wine and reduce it again. Probably reducing it by about a half. So by reducing, I literally mean taking the liquid, the water, out of the liquid that you are boiling. This does 2 things. It changes the consistency a little bit, makes it slightly more syrupy, but it also really intensifies the flavour, and that hopefully will give us a great sauce. Okay, 4 or 5 minutes have passed. We've reduced the wine and balsamic down to not very much liquid at all if you look at it. My kitchen smells amazing, but we're going to add another layer of flavour and reduce again. This is some chicken stock, and I'm going to add a good splash, 1/4 of a pint, something like that, 150 millilitres, somewhere in that neck of the woods. Doesn't really matter for accuracy because you're going to reduce it anyway. So I'm going to put this back on the heat and then another 5 or 6 minutes to reduce. Right, we're now about 10 minutes into the cooking. Things are starting to crisp up. The skin is just beginning to crisp up on the chicken. I'm going to turn the potatoes, but I'm only going to turn them once, and I'm not going to turn them particularly aggressively. This will be the only time I will turn the potatoes, because we don't want them to turn to mush, because they are quite small. Then, as soon as you can say it, back in the oven, and back to the roasting. The chicken is about 5 minutes away from coming out of the oven. It's time to finish our sauce. Now, I brought on a second saucepan, slightly smaller, because I want to strain out all the bits and pieces that are in our reduced sauce. You can see how little there is of it, but I'm going to make sure that every little bit of flavour comes out. Now, when it comes to knowing when the sauce is right, you need to keep tasting it. The shallots will eventually give up a sweetness that will tell you that the sauce is basically ready, and you'll be left with a cupful, a wine glass full of sauce, maybe slightly more. That needs now to have about 30 grams, maybe 40 grams of butter whisked into it. So once you've whisked this in, it will give the sauce a beautiful sheen, but it will not last forever as an emulsion. So you need to keep it just warm until you serve the final dish. So here we are, chicken and parmentier potatoes. Now, what I'm going to do, first and foremost, is I'm going to take the chicken and I'm going to pop it on the board, and I'm going to let it rest for just 2 or 3 minutes. It doesn't need much more than that. It's not like a large joint that needs an awful lot of money. The parmentier I'm going to pop back into the oven, which I have turned off, so they'll just keep warm and crisp. Now, moving on to the kale. What I did with this, I steamed it, and then when I thought it was cooked enough, which was only about 4 or 5 minutes, I took it off the heat and I ran cold water over it and what we call refreshed it. This means that I stopped the cooking exactly at that point. What it does, it means that it retains this lovely green colour without going grey. If I'd allowed it to cool naturally, it would go grey and horrible. This works for all kinds of things. It works for asparagus, it works for broccoli, it works for all sorts of things. And it's actually one of the ways in which restaurants make their vegetables look so spanking fresh, is that they refresh and then they reheat. What I'm going to do, I'm going to pop a piece of butter into a frying pan, and I'm going to simply turn this over in the frying pan. One thing I will not forget, however, I will not forget, is pepper. Brassicas, cabbages in essence, love, love, love pepper. Okay, so that's gone in the pan with the butter. And a mighty large twist of pepper. So, the chicken. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the daggers from in here and put them to one side for safety. Please feel free to do this without using your fingers. Don't want to see anybody burnt. And I'm going to start plating up. So, the carving of these legs. Now, we have to bear in mind that in here there is a bone. So we're not going to be able to cut through there. So I'm going to leave the drumstick entirely whole. What I am going to do, however, is I'm going to carve the thigh. It might start looking a little bit untidy, but it will be absolutely fine in the end. So, holding the drumstick with the tongs, I'm going to cut through the thigh just 3 times. I'm going to do exactly the same with the other thigh. Now it's worth remembering, these are not going to look identical on a plate because one is a left thigh and one is a right thigh because I took them off a whole bird a little bit earlier today. But again, I am going to only cut 3 times. So, time to pop them on a plate and make them look pretty. Let's take the drumstick and pop it there. And take these 3 lovely stuffed pieces of chicken and lay them, ooh, not cut through, there's a bit of a shame. Take these lovely bits of chicken and lay them out to look like that. Same again with this one, just the other way. I think we nearly had a blowout there, but luckily all is well. Now, an old friend to this YouTube channel is cauliflower puree. The recipe for this is on the duck dinner that's probably a couple of recipes back. And it's basically cauliflower boiled in stock and cream and then pureed. I'm just going to do a very chefy swirl on the plate of this. Something like that. Now, those of you who have tried this will know that that is nowhere near enough. So there's plenty here. I would probably put a little bowl on the table as well to go with that. So, getting the potatoes out again. They're kept beautifully warm in the oven. They are, as you can see, beautifully crisp and roasty like. You don't need very many of them. They're quite calorific and quite carby. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little pile of them in the middle of the plate like that. Maybe just a couple more. A pile of them in the middle of the plate like that. Beautiful. Okay, cabbage time. The cabbage has sizzled away, lots of pepper in it, and it's reignited its flavours. And I'm just going to put the tiniest little bit, or that's how it feels, there. Now you, I'm sure, will take much more time over presentation than I am, but at the end of the day we are just making dinner. Finally, the sauce. Now, the sauce is unashamedly a very thin sauce. It's not like Grandma's gravy at all. It is very much a thin sauce. In fact, the puree is quite like Grandma's gravy normally. But all I'm going to do is run this sauce over the chicken. And let it run through the rest of the dish. Now, only one single thing remains to be done with that. And that is, add a couple of glasses of wine. So there we have it, Chicken Margaret. Cheers, Mum.